Hi, I'm Manny Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS legal hotline lawyer, and this is the third video in our series entitled Dangerous Business Practices in a Seller's Market. And in this video, we want to look specifically, let me introduce first of all, I'm joined by Paul Blumenstetter. Paul?
Paul Blumenstetter, designated broker owner of RE/MAX Integrity. Happy to be here.
Paul teaches a lot of brokers business practices, good business practices, and so I'm grateful that he would join us for this video series because he's helping me understand what the marketplace is like and just how tight the market is. And because of that, I understand that there are a lot of buyers out there who, frustrated from the effort to, or the failed effort to purchase property, are choosing to make offers where they waive all inspections. That's a very scary offer term, in my opinion. We need to look at this issue from both the buyer's perspective and the seller's perspective, and we're going to do that in this video. So first, let's look at this from the buyer's perspective. If a buyer makes an offer and voluntarily walks away from any opportunity to inspect a property, understand that the judiciary, the legal system, court system, when a buyer makes a post-closing claim against a seller, claiming that the seller misrepresented some condition on the property, the first question the court's going to ask a buyer is, buyer, how did you protect yourself? Did you perform due diligence to determine the condition of that property for yourself? Because if you didn't, a court is likely to leave you where they found you. To say, look, buyer, if you chose not to protect yourself, we are not going to protect you. If the seller lied or misrepresented or took advantage of you and you did everything that you could to protect yourself, but it was the seller's deceit, not your lack of self-protection that caused your damages, then the court may give you relief. But it is more likely than not, buyers, that if you walk away from all due diligence voluntarily because you are so desperate to be the buyer chosen to purchase the property, it's entirely possible that in a post-closing environment where you find out that you purchased something you really wish you hadn't, and had you known prior to closing what you know now you wouldn't have purchased, to go to a court at that point and say, give me relief, the court is likely to say, let's see your due diligence. And if all you can show is a waiver of inspection contingency, buyers, you may find yourself in trouble. So buyer brokers, if you're the one writing the offer where buyer has waived their inspection contingency, that makes me very nervous.
Absolutely. It should be a foregone conclusion by every buyer broker that you never suggest or recommend to a buyer not to do an inspection on a property. And in fact, if they elect not to want to do that, you should have it in writing that you advised them to do that and they ignored your advice and chose to write an offer without an inspection. The risks are too great for a buyer, and I understand in today's market buyers are desperate to get properties, but it's not worth the risk. Buyers need to understand that they, for the reasons that Annie pointed out, they have to have protection from themselves, and the way to do that is to do an inspection.
So in the video where we were talking about how buyer brokers protect themselves, one of the things we talked about is making sure that you've got the buyer's consent to the crazy offer terms that they're making. Form 35, your inspection contingency addendum, is set up for you to be able to establish in writing that this really is buyer's idea. Paul, how does a buyer broker do that?
Well, one of the things that I always, as a designated broker, that I always look at my transactions that come across my desk is to make sure that a 35 is included in every offer. And it could be that the inspection box was checked, and it could be that the waiver inspection box was checked. But in that way, the buyer broker is protecting themselves because it shows in writing by checking the waiver box that they did advise their buyer to get an inspection and they chose not to do that. So that's one safeguard for buyer brokers, to make sure that they have that in writing.
Paul, any suggestions to a buyer broker who says, look, I've explained to my buyer the risk of waiving the inspection contingency, they don't get it, and I'm not a lawyer, so I can't explain to them what the risks are of walking away from due diligence. Any suggestions to that buyer broker?
My suggestion would be to tell the buyer broker they need to seek legal advice. If they won't listen to their broker as an expert in the field of inspections and the risks that are involved in them, then they should at least go to an attorney and get some legal advice to do that. Again, buyers are desperate right now, and they are listening or thinking, they're taking their direction basically from the listing brokers and the sellers, and if the listing broker or seller is saying, write your offer without an inspection, they are so desperate that they want to do that. And it's very difficult for buyer brokers right now to try to let them see the risks associated with losing the property perhaps. So get legal advice.
Yeah, I agree with Paul. In fact, not just that you should make that suggestion, but you actually have an agency law duty to make that suggestion. Recall your agency law duty to advise your client to seek the advice of an expert in areas that exceed the scope of your expertise. If buyer wants to walk away from all inspections, that buyer needs to be advised by you in writing to seek legal counsel, to talk to a home inspector, probably to talk to a pest inspector about the risks associated with purchasing property without conducting any inspections. And if all else fails, show them this video. I just explained the risks to a buyer of choosing to purchase without exercising due diligence. Let your buyer hear it from me, and then advise them to seek legal counsel, because they really should hear it from the lawyer who represents them, not a lawyer providing educational information on a video. Okay.
And they certainly don't want to get the advice of the listing broker or the seller that they don't need to do it, because that's the person that's not representing their best interest.
So then, Paul, how is it that a seller would give advice to a buyer about waiving inspections, or a listing broker would give advice to a buyer about waiving inspections?
Well, they're basically saying that if you waive your inspection, then you have a better chance of getting the property.
What's the actual medium through which we're seeing that communication?
Oh, that's usually done through an offer instruction sheet, and it appears on there as one of the instructions that the listing broker / seller is putting on, requesting as a suggestion or request that buyer brokers and buyers write offers that do not include an inspection contingency.
Okay, so Paul, what you're talking about is a document that's often attached as an uploaded document to the MLS printout, right?
Correct.
And it's entitled Offer Instructions or Suggestions for Writing, whatever it's entitled. It's the idea is buyer broker, read this document, conform your buyer's offer to the suggestions, instructions, whatever they are.
Absolutely.
And we talked about this in the first video, and Paul explained that oftentimes these offer instructions are used as a filter by listing brokers to determine which offers rise to the top for presentation to the seller.
Correct.
So, Paul, if one of the offer instructions is make an offer waiving buyer's inspection contingency, does that cause you angst on behalf of the seller? We've already talked about the risk to the buyer. What about risks to the seller?
Oh, I think the risks to the seller are huge, because they're basically denying the buyer the right to due diligence to inspect the property. And listing brokers are doing that as a way to make the transaction go easier, so there's less out for the buyer, less loopholes to close the deal, and it's just putting their seller, their client, at great risk.
Paul is absolutely right. So how does that then fit into what I said a few minutes ago about buyers not conducting due diligence? Isn't it still then, if the seller has said no inspection contingency, isn't that buyer just not conducting their due diligence? And there, as Paul said, there is a huge difference in a buyer voluntarily choosing not to conduct due diligence versus a seller dictating that a buyer is not allowed to do due diligence. If the seller says, buyer, bring an offer to me and do not include an inspection contingency, then the seller is the party in the transaction denying buyer the ability to conduct due diligence. And the court's going to understand that in this post-closing litigation. So from the seller's perspective, listing broker, when you include in your offer instructions a notation that buyer's offer should be written without an inspection contingency, what you are doing is creating the lawsuit for buyer's benefit post-closing. Because instead, what the seller is saying is, here's the condition of the property, buyer, trust me, it's an adequate, complete description of the condition of property, and you will not conduct due diligence.
And here's the irony of the whole thing, Annie, is that the majority, or I shouldn't say majority, but many transactions today by buyers do not include inspection contingencies because the buyers are getting savvy, knowing that that's a weakness in their offer to get it accepted.
Because the buyers are getting desperate, I would say.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so they are volunteering to eliminate the inspection contingency just so they have a better shot at the property. So the reality of it and the irony of it is that the listing broker really doesn't have to ask any longer for that to happen because the buyer is doing it voluntarily. So then they don't put the seller at risk because, as you mentioned, it was the buyer's idea to forfeit due diligence rather than the seller's denying it.
So let's make really clear what Paul just said. Notwithstanding all of the good advice we gave to buyers and buyer brokers in the beginning of this video, the truth is many buyers are going to make offers today without including an inspection contingency. And when a buyer does that, they potentially forfeit any post-closing liability recovery claim for liability after closing because the buyer voluntarily chose not to conduct due diligence. But listing brokers, if you post offer instructions on the MLS and one of your offer instructions is bring an offer waiving your inspection contingency, you have all of a sudden converted seller's post-closing defense to liability to buyer's post-closing claim. By your simple 8 or 10 words that say don't bring an inspection contingency, you have changed the entire nature of the post-closing litigation from one where buyer is on defense to one where seller is on defense. And what Paul just said is the irony of all that is if you are just mum with respect to inspection contingencies in your offer instructions, chances are your seller's going to get an offer without an inspection contingency, or at least they might.
And if the seller knows that they have two offers to choose from and one has an inspection contingency attached to it and one does not, then they know they have a clear decision to make as far as whether they want to be liable in post-closing situations by allowing the inspection. And they may have a property that they have no qualms about, that their home is going to pass an inspection with flying colors. Why deny it? Why take away that risk?
So, Paul, I have one more question for you. Something that I've seen lately, and it's befuddling to me, is sellers accept offers without an inspection contingency, and then the buyer broker comes along either after mutual acceptance or even during the negotiations prior to mutual acceptance and says, we're not going to include an inspection contingency, but after mutual acceptance, buyer is still going to inspect seller's property for information only.
That is becoming a more common practice than you can possibly imagine. I'm seeing it more and more all the time. And it's absolutely ridiculous that any listing broker or seller would allow a buyer into their home with no inspection contingency for a various number of reasons, least of the least which is liability.
I always summarize this conversation by saying there is absolutely no good that comes to seller from an informational only inspection by buyer broker. Listing broker, advise your seller against allowing any inspection of their home outside the requirements of an inspection contingency. Read the first paragraph of Form 35, and if you do, you'll see that when buyer inspects seller's home subject to the inspection contingency, they're required to use a licensed home inspector. The buyer is liable for any damages they commit to seller's property. They're prohibited from doing any invasive inspection, and they are prohibited from delivering a copy of the inspection report to the seller without the seller's permission. You do sellers, you allow, listing brokers, you allow an inspection outside the confines of Form 35. It is the wild, wild west. A buyer can bring anybody in to do the inspection. They can create a horrific inspection report and they can give that to seller as leverage to force the seller to make the concessions buyer is seeking. It's utterly preposterous.
And here's another way to look at it too, that's even worse than that. So you allow the buyer back in the house to do an inspection without an inspection contingency. The buyer decides that they don't want to buy the house based on what they find, and they find another legal excuse to get out of the deal, and all of a sudden the seller now has no buyer. Who do you think the seller's going to be angry at?
Yeah. Okay, anything else on this topic?
I think we got it covered.
All right. From no matter who you represent, whether it's the seller or the buyer, be careful of the offer term that leaves buyer waiving the inspection contingency. And one thing that we didn't cover, we covered this in the first video, but it bears repeating. If you are the listing broker, and if your seller does include an offer instruction that suggests to the buyer that they waive their inspection contingency, you absolutely have seller's signature on the face of that instruction, so that it is seller's instruction, not yours. And you, listing broker, advise the seller to seek the advice of legal counsel so that they can understand everything that we have said in this video from their own lawyer about the risk to seller in suggesting, or worse yet, requiring that a buyer waive the inspection contingency. Remember, the offer instructions must be seller's instructions, not listing broker's instructions.
Correct.
Okay. Questions on the topics we've discussed in this video or any other, send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.